finally, we have a final speaker today, and that is Ben Norton. I think probably most of you know who he is, but just in case you don't, he is, in fact, well, there's some interesting new things about Ben. So Ben is the founder and editor-in-chief of a new website. He's recast his old website, Multipolarista, into a new format, a new name, called Geopolitical Economy Report. It is an independent news website dedicated to publishing original journalism and analysis. Ben has reported from numerous countries, including Venezuela, Nicaragua, Bolivia, Ecuador, Honduras, Colombia, and others. So Ben, please go ahead.
It's a real pleasure being here. Thanks for inviting me. And today the topic is clearly Brazil, and it's a real pleasure being here with a collection of comrades from Brazil who clearly know significantly more about the country and its politics than I do. So I was thinking the way that I could contribute today is focusing on the larger regional context. Unfortunately, most of my experience in Latin America has been in the Spanish-speaking countries, and there is a lot in common politically, but my familiarity directly with Brazil is not as strong. So what I wanted to talk about is the regional context and the very critical role that Brazil plays in that. Of course, it goes without saying that Brazil is the largest country in Latin America. It has the largest economy. It's also the 6th most populous country on earth. And I think the return to power of Lula da Silva is absolutely monumental, not only for the region, but for the entire world, because we talk a lot about multipolarity and the progressive potential for multipolarity, but it's not only the rise of China and the reassertion of Russia's sovereignty that is part of that move toward multipolarity. It's also a move toward regional integration and creating new poles of political and economic power. And Lula, for decades, has been calling for the integration of Latin America and the Caribbean and the creation of a new political and economic pole for the region. Latin America and the Caribbean represent a new pole in this increasingly multipolar world, and you can't have regional integration in Latin America without Brazil. And we saw not only in the past 4 years, but in the past 6 years, since the 2016 US-backed coup against the Workers' Party President Dilma Rousseff, that Brazil was essentially subordinated to US imperialism. Even before Bolsonaro, it's easy to forget the years of neoliberal rule under Michel Temer after this US-backed coup, in which Brazil subordinated its independent foreign policy to Washington and its economic policy. It was Temer who opened the gates for neoliberal reforms that were only accelerated under Bolsonaro and his Chicago boy economic minister, Paulo Guedes, who, let's not forget, had taught economics in universities in Chile under Pinochet, because he was such a big supporter of the Pinochet regime. So it's deeply important, not only symbolically, but at a political and economic level, that Lula's first trip abroad was to Argentina, to the meeting of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, an organization that Lula helped to give birth to as an alternative to the Organization of American States, which was created by the United States. Cuba has long referred to the OAS as the Yankee Ministry of the Colonies. Cuba was expelled, and then Venezuela was on the verge of being expelled, and it left with dignity. Nicaragua also left with dignity. This is an organization, the OAS, that has been complicit in coups in Latin America as recently as 2019, in which the OAS backed a fascist violent coup against the democratically elected president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, the first ever indigenous president in a majority indigenous country. And we know that Lula criticized that coup in Bolivia, although he wasn't in power. He criticized the Organization of American States, and he's played an important role in cultivating CELAC as an alternative. CELAC being an organization that includes all of the countries in the Americas, excluding the United States and Canada. Furthermore, it's extremely important that when he visited Argentina, Brazilian President Lula announced that Brazil and Argentina are already making plans to create a new currency, a bilateral currency for trade, and that will eventually spread into a multilateral currency. All countries in Latin America will be invited to use it. And furthermore, not only is this extremely important to challenge US dollar hegemony, but I think it's a model for the entire world, because what Latin America is now trying to do with the leadership of brilliant left-wing economists is to challenge the neoliberal model that the Eurozone implemented. And in fact, an Ecuadorian economist who helped to create the Sucre currency in the Bolivarian alliance, the ALBA, back under leftist president Rafael Correa, he did a Twitter thread this past week discussing, responding to criticisms, neoliberal criticisms made by economists affiliated with the IMF and the World Bank, who referred to this idea as crazy. And he said, no, in fact, this is exactly what John Maynard Keynes had proposed in the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 with his proposal of the Bancor. And this Ecuadorian economist who is involved in the creation of the Sucre currency, he pointed out that this is not a currency that will be adopted as the national currencies of Brazil and Argentina and other countries in the region. Rather, it will be a unit of account that will allow these countries to increase their bilateral trade within Latin America and the Caribbean without the need for US dollars, which will help countries like Argentina, which have been terminally trapped in foreign currency denominated debt, largely dollar denominated debt for well over 100 years. I mean, even before its dollar denominated debt, Argentina suffered with pound sterling denominated debt. And this has trapped the region in a form of neocolonialism. That means that even if it's politically independent from European colonial powers or the US empire, it still is economically largely not sovereign in its economic affairs. So Lula understands the importance of economic sovereignty for Latin America. And as the largest economic power in the region, you can't overstate the importance of Brazil, not only having a progressive leader, but a leader who wants to turn Latin America into a significant political and economic power in a multipolar world. Because it's not just about regional integration, it's about independence for Latin America and the Caribbean so it can be a pole in this multipolar world. Let's not forget, Lula himself was a co-founder of the BRICS system. He was one of the main masterminds behind the BRICS. He recognized the potential that Latin America and the Caribbean has as a region. This is a region that has, hundreds of millions of people. It has every natural resource and commodity that is needed for advanced industrialized economies, not only oil and gas, not only significant minerals, not only agriculture, but also water. Latin America and the Caribbean has very significant water resources, which as we face climate catastrophe in the world, this is going to be something that's increasingly important. And I mentioned the mineral wealth. Peru has some, and Chile have the largest copper reserves in the world, but also lithium, a mineral that is becoming increasingly important as the world transitions toward renewable energy. And we know that the so-called copper triangle, especially Bolivia, has the largest lithium reserves in the world. And the revolutionary process initiated by Evo Morales and continued by current president Luis Arce has shown the new potential for socialism in the 21st century, for building a new economic model in which those natural resources belong to the people of Bolivia and are used to develop industrial policies. And in Brazil, it's been quite remarkable to see how Lula has pushed a very progressive economic program, not only challenging neoliberalism, but talking about the importance of nationalization of key industries, of reversing the privatizations carried out by Bolsonaro and Paulo Guedes. And Lula, in his inauguration speech, stressed that his most important priority is making sure that a country that exports food has no hunger. He said it's ridiculous that there are tens of millions of Brazilians who suffer from hunger in a country that is an agricultural exporter. So I think in this situation of Latin American increasing integration, not only among itself, but with the BRICS system, Latin America and the Caribbean can be a model for other regions of the world, of the global South, for Africa, for parts of Asia, showing the way in this path toward economic development outside of the neoliberal model. I think it shouldn't be controversial to say that Latin America is probably, from a political and economic perspective, the most progressive region of the world. The vast majority of the governments today in Latin America are left-wing. And until the coup in December in Peru, although we've seen massive popular resistance against that, until that coup in December, the six most populist governments in Latin America had left-wing leaders. So, of course, Brazil being key among them. So, I mean, I think we really need to see the role that Latin America can play as it has really since the Cuban Revolution in 1959, as helping to pave a path for other countries around the global South, around the world, to figure out ways to develop alternatives to neoliberalism and also capitalism. And finally, I'll say that from outside of their economic policy, in terms of their foreign policy, Lula and other leaders in the region have played a very progressive role. I mentioned that Lula was a co-founder of the BRIC system, but he has also been a voice for peace, which is extremely important at this moment of escalation of what some have referred to as the beginning of the Third World War. A prominent French scholar, not a socialist, not a revolutionary, not an anti-imperialist, named Emmanuel Todd, he has written a new book called The Third World War Has Begun, in which he said that the proxy war in Ukraine is the beginning of the Third World War. A top US general just revealed that the US soldiers are preparing for war with China within 2 years. He said by 2025. And we see that now the United States and Germany are sending tanks to Ukraine in a massive escalation in this NATO proxy war against Russia. And in response to that escalation, Lula and other leaders in Latin America have called for peace and opposed escalation and militarization. Lula himself has refused requests by Western powers to send weapons to and tank ammunition to Ukraine. Furthermore, the first ever left-wing president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, has likewise refused to send military equipment to Ukraine, calling for peace. And in fact, today is January 29th. Just yesterday, on the 28th, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz visited Buenos Aires, and there he met with Argentine President Alberto Fernandez. And even he, who is probably the least left-wing of all of the left-wing leaders in Latin America, even Fernandez refused to send weapons to Ukraine and called for peace instead of escalation of this conflict. So having Lula as a leader in the most populous and the largest country in Latin America is, I think, a massive boon to the progressive movement in the region and in the world, a voice challenging neoliberalism, calling for South-South cooperation, calling for regional integration, and most important of all, calling for peace and de-escalation of this war that threatens quite literally nuclear apocalypse. If there is a nuclear exchange, that's not going to be a nuclear exchange simply between NATO and Russia. It's going to mean the end of human civilization. So this is an issue that could not be more urgent.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.